If you really want to understand America, what it is, where its power comes from, its whole identity, you have to look at the one thing that has shaped it more than anything else: war.
You know, we all know the classic stories, right? Pilgrims, pioneers, all that. But what if the real story, the one that's kind of baked into the nation's DNA, is a whole lot more violent? What if the real answer to how America was made is found on the battlefield?
I mean, just think about that quote. It wasn't just influenced by war. It wasn't just born during a war. Its very first breath was an act of war. And that one moment would set the course for pretty much everything that followed.
All right, so let's start right there, at the beginning. Let's look at the very first crucible of conflict that forged this new nation. Seriously, stop and think about how wild that is. This wasn't a normal war over a piece of land or some resources. The American Revolution was a fight for an idea, this completely radical notion that people could govern themselves. A small handful of colonies decided to take on the biggest, baddest empire on the planet for a principle.
And right here, we see a theme that's going to pop up again and again. Winning one war rarely led to a period of calm. Nope, instead, it just set the stage for the next fight. This pattern just keeps building into the next major chapter as this young nation started looking west. But this whole period of massive growth would, in the end, lead to a war against itself. To really get this era, you have to understand this one concept: manifest destiny. Now, this wasn't just some dry government policy. It was a deeply held, almost religious belief that America had a divine mission to spread across the entire continent. A really powerful idea, and a really dangerous one. And that so-called fate came at a huge, huge cost. This expansion wasn't peaceful. It was done by force. We're talking brutal wars against Native American tribes and a full-on war with Mexico that completely redrew the map. All of it came at an incredible, staggering human cost. So, just as the nation finally stretches to the Pacific, it turns inward and just fractures. The Civil War wasn't just another conflict, it was a total identity crisis. It forced the country to finally answer two giant questions it had been kicking down the road since day one. Is this whole experiment even going to survive? And can slavery be allowed to continue?
The war provided answers, all right? Brutal, definitive answers. The nation would survive, federal power was here to stay, and legal slavery would end. But that resolution came at the cost of more American lives than all its other wars combined. The country was saved, but it was scarred forever.
Okay, so after the country starts to stitch itself back together, its gaze starts to shift. It starts looking outward. This next phase is all about the transition from a continental power to a real global player. You see, all that industrial muscle built during and after the Civil War created a new kind of America, one with interests and ambitions that just couldn't be contained by its own borders anymore. The whole era of isolationism was coming to a close.
You had some early steps, like the Spanish-American War, but the real game changer, World War I. That was the moment. By jumping into a massive European war, America basically torched its long tradition of staying out of other people's fights. For the first time, it was projecting its power across the Atlantic, helping to decide the fate of empires and carving out a new identity as a major world power.
And if World War I was the turning point, World War II was the great transformation. I mean, look at this. Before the war, America was still, for the most part, keeping to itself. After, it was undeniably a global superpower. The war was the catalyst that didn't just transform the country, it flipped the entire world order on its head.
The scale of World War II was something else entirely. The entire nation mobilized for one single purpose: victory. And the war didn't just end with a surrender. It ended with the dawn of the atomic age, unleashing a whole new level of power and terror onto the world stage.
So winning the biggest war in human history should bring lasting peace, right? Well, not exactly. The very nature of war itself was about to change again, shifting from a fight between nations to a fight between ideas.
And there's that theme again. Peace did not follow. The end of the world's biggest hot war gave way almost immediately to a brand new, very different kind of global struggle. The fighting didn't stop, it just changed its form. And this was the Cold War. It wasn't a traditional war fought on battlefields. It was a global, half-century-long struggle of ideologies: capitalism versus communism. It was fought with spies, with political standoffs, and through incredibly brutal proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam. And all the while, the entire planet lived under the constant, terrifying shadow of nuclear annihilation.
And then, in the 21st century, the definition of war changed. Again. After September 11th, we entered the War on Terror. The enemy wasn't a country with an army anymore. It was a global network, driven by an idea. The battlefields became, well, everywhere and nowhere at once. And the tactics evolved to include things like drones and mass surveillance, in conflicts that felt like they had no clear end.
So after all of this, after all these crucibles, these trials by fire, what's the lasting legacy? What has more than 2 centuries of near-constant conflict actually created?
When you look at it laid out like this, from the Revolution to the War on Terror, you can see it clearly. These aren't just separate events. They're links in a chain. They're the defining chapters of the American story, and each one builds on the last, shaping whatever comes next.
And this, right here, is the key takeaway. If you look at America's history through the lens of its wars, you see this fundamental tension played out over and over again. It's the struggle between the nation's founding ideals of freedom and the incredible power and force it is used to defend and expand them.
Ultimately, understanding this long, complicated relationship with conflict is about way more than just a history lesson. It's not simply about looking backward. It decides the future. Because the way a nation uses force in its past inevitably shapes the choices it's going to make tomorrow. This crucible of conflict, it's not over, it's ongoing, and its history is helping to decide what comes next.